So I have a little bit of a presentation, and then I have some questions that you can think about while we're talking today. Right. So to start off, I spend a lot of my time with about 400 years of costumes. We interpret at Strawbery Banke all the way. This year at Candlelight Stroll, we're doing the 1720s, which I think is the earliest we've ever done, all the way up to the 1950s. And so we'll talk a little bit about the earlier side of things today. Some things to think about as you are joining along with this is who we interpret, who we portray at Strawbery Banke. Who are the people that you see walking around from day to day? And those are obviously our role players, but they're portraying real people who lived and worked and, did their daily chores here, there, and all over the Puddle Dock neighborhood. And so we're talking about real people who had ages and birthdays and baptisms and a whole life story. They're not just, figures from a play that we sort of have to flesh out. And all of these questions that we have up here go into creating a costume for each of those role players to wear. So first up, who's being portrayed? When we talk about folks from the 18th century, the 1700s, we're mostly talking about sort of upper middling class people like the Stavers family or the Wheelwright family who had ties to the maritime industry. The Stavers family owned the William Pitt Tavern. And so they were working people. They worked really hard for a living, but they also lived pretty comfortable lives. They're obviously located in the Puddle Dock neighborhood in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And Portsmouth in this time period, the period around the Revolutionary War, is there's a lot of English influence. There's some French influence. There's lots of people trading really from all over the world through the ports of Portsmouth and Newburyport and Boston. And so there are lots of international influences too. And then, we talk about what makes a person unique. So not just where they live and, how old they are, but maybe we know that, so-and-so liked to smoke a pipe, or maybe we know that this person kept a diary and they enjoyed the finer things in life. So how do we find all of that out? And I promise we'll get to costumes, but we have to do a lot of research on the people before we get to the costume part. So how do we find out, what was accessible to people, what people were like? We know that we have a lot of belongings, things that are in our collection today that belong to people in the past. So we have objects that tell us about how people used, everyday things and what materials those things are made out of. We have inventories and probate records. We have receipts from shopping excursions or trading. And then we have things like diaries or newspaper articles that tell us a little bit about, a person's life. And all of those things we call primary sources because they're coming out of the time period that the person lived in. So when we go to create a costume, we're not just putting something together that is, beautiful, although many of our costumes are beautiful. We're putting together something that is based on real primary sources. So whether that is a real garment, something that's a piece of clothing that someone wore in the past that exists in a collection, or someone's diary entry, or someone's receipt for fabric that they purchased, all of those things contribute to how we make costuming. So here are a few examples of what we would call extant clothing or garments. They're things that were created in the 18th century that are existent in museum collections today. So these are some just really good, clear images that I have of pieces from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, a kerchief, which we'll talk about all of these items in a few minutes, but you can see that they're, not in the best shape, but they are 200 years old, so they're in pretty good shape. And so they can tell us a lot about what kind of stitches people used, what is the quality of the material, sometimes with stains and pieces that needed to be mended, you can tell how something was used and where it got a lot of wear. You can see in the middle here, the kerchief, which would go around your neck, has a lot of stains. So what does that tell us about the person who wore it? We also use quite a bit of, primary source documentation where we can find it. This is awesome because it is really personal. This is taken from a young girl's diary. She was 10 or 11 years old in 1771, and her name was Anna Green Winslow. She was living with her aunt and uncle in Boston, going to finishing school. And she's writing back to her parents frequently, telling her mother about life in Boston. And she comments, because she's a young girl, she's very conscious of her appearance and being in a new city. She comments a lot on her clothing and other people's clothing. So she talks about how her own wardrobe doesn't really fit in Boston. She talks about having a black hat, which is, for the social class that she's in, maybe a little bit out of date in this time period. And her domine, which like a sort of like a loose fitting coat, usually made out of silk. She doesn't think it fits in very well. She thinks it would cause a stir on Sudbury Street. So this is great. And Anna Green Winslow's diary is full of information like this, like how she does her hair for a social event, and what color ribbons she wears with what type of dress, which is so interesting because it's like all the little details that get lost in everyday life. We also have contemporary sources from illustrations, woodcuts, portraits that portray people as they were. Something like this is in the lower left-hand corner, Charles Wilson Peele portrait of a woman and her grandson. So that obviously took a little bit more detail and observation. And then we have some other things, sketches. This is a woman who was called a nanny. So she may have worked for a family caring for their children in a house. And these tell us, they're all very different styles artistically. They're all portraying very different people, but they tell us a little bit about common themes through a certain time period. So you can see that almost every one of the women portrayed here is wearing some kind of kerchief or a cap. Some of them are wearing necklaces of ribbon. And it's sort of interesting to see little commonalities between very different styles, both, you know, artistically and maybe personally. Maybe that was this particular individual's personal style. We also have really great resources, especially in Portsmouth, which was so tied to the maritime industry. And, you know, we had lots of merchants, especially in and around the Puddle Dock neighborhood. We had lots and lots of newspapers in print in and out of the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Portsmouth and in New Hampshire in general. And so a lot of advertisements tell us what people were selling, what materials they had in. And so, you know, we see things like silk or trousers or waistcoats, waistcoats, and that sort of thing that appear in personal documents. This is part of a ledger from someone's inventory. So when we put all of that together and then we go to construct someone's daily wear for a role player, we have to consider all of those things, and then we have to get started making the costumes. So what we typically do is we look at patterns that have already been really well researched. We have lots of examples of women, you know, represented in art or in other documents through this time period. And we start to put together, you know, what someone in the Stavers family might have worn for their daily life working in a tavern. So as a quick exercise, I want you to look at the 3 images here. 2 of them are British, 1 is American, and try to, you know, think to yourself what a woman working in a tavern would wear on a daily basis. So she's probably a figure in the community. She's probably going to wear some fairly nice clothing, but she also has to care for guests. She's probably doing a lot of cooking and cleaning. You know, what garments would you choose from all of the women who are here to clothe someone like Catherine Stavers in the Pit Tavern? So we have, you know, some really basic things, garments like a shift, which is like a very loose fitting slip, usually made of cotton or linen that you wear underneath. And ladies, this lady is actually in a bathtub. She's taking a bath with her shift on. So it's a very, very basic, I guess you would call it like a staple in your wardrobe. Stockings and garters are things that both men and women would wear, no matter what social class. And then stays, which sometimes you hear them called corsets, but in the late 18th century, we'd call them stays. They're a little bit different. They're a little more flexible than a corset. They're usually made of reeds, and they're made to give you a certain shape, but they're also there for support, especially for women who are working. So next, once you've got your shift and your stockings and your stays on, you're going to put your pocket on. And that is something that we don't often think about doing. I don't think about putting my pocket on in the morning because they're sewn into our clothes today, right? But pockets were detachable in the late 18th century. They were actually like a little bag with strings that you tied around your waist. And that was really so that you didn't really have to empty your pockets at the end of every day. You just take your pocket off. And if you need to switch your skirt or something, I think it's quite convenient. Pockets are worn underneath all the rest of your clothing, just like you would have today. They're not hanging out because otherwise you wouldn't be a little more obvious a target for a pickpocket, I guess. So once you've got your pocket on, you're going to tie on some petticoats. And it's a little hard. These are all period illustrations, but it's a little hard to tell that most of these are very adjustable garments. So you have long strings or pins or occasionally a hook and eye that will fasten your garment, and we'll see an up close image of that shortly. But your petticoats are sort of the next thing that go on, and that's your skirt. So we think of petticoats today as being something you would wear underneath the skirt to make it a little bit fluffier. Petticoats were just petticoats. It was just your skirt, but you would layer your petticoats typically. And so on a day like today that's very cold, you might wear a few more layers of petticoats than on a day in the summer, perhaps. You also have a short gown, which is, you know, a gown would go all the way down the length of your, however long your dress is. Your skirts are. A short gown ends just a little bit above your hips, I guess. And sometimes you have a bedgown, which is much longer, but not all the way down to the ground. So there's lots of variation, even in the late 18th century with costuming, with garb. Once you have your base layers on, so your short gown is sort of like your blouse, your petticoat is like your skirt, you're going to put on a kerchief that is a little bit for modesty, a little bit for practical wear. Your kerchief is very useful in that you can wrap it around your shoulders. So if you have a gap in where your gown is fitting, you have just a little more coverage, but it also is interchangeable. So if you're wearing the same short gown from day to day, you might be able to tuck your kerchief underneath your short gown so that any sweat that you're sweating on your neck or your shoulders or your chest is can be washed a little bit more easily. Very important that you have an apron. This is called a bib apron. Sometimes you call them pinner aprons because you had to pin up the bib, but the bib apron is really nice because it covers up, again, all of your, the rest of your clothing that you don't want to get dirty. You're not going to be able to just throw things in the wash if you have a little, spill. So you will also want a cap because that's going to help partially keep your hair contained. Partially, it's going to protect your hair from any of the cleaning, cooking, any of the chores that you're doing. And then just to round out the rest of your, round out the rest of your outfit, you've got some additional things. Well, of course, you're going to need shoes if you leave the house. And probably as you're walking around the house, you're going to want some shoes too. There's no vacuums, so it's brooms only. And it's going to be a little gritty, a little sandy in your stockings. So you can see here, this is actually a girl's short gown that's fastened with pins, which is really interesting. You don't usually get to see that really minute detail. Up close, you have garters that are going to keep your really long stockings on. They go up above the knee. And if you don't have elastic quite yet, no elasticized socks. So your garters are going to be tied around and fastened to keep you from, hunching over and pulling up your stockings all day long while you get work done. And then if you are going outside and you need a little extra, shade from the sun, you might wear a market bonnet or a bergère, which a market bonnet is usually made of silk with a very wide brim. And this is the type of black hat that Anna Green Winslow is talking about in her diary. And then the bergère is sometimes called a milkmaid's hat. It's just very plain and straw, sometimes decorated in ribbons. And then on a day like this, you will want a cape, certainly, to keep warm. And a cape is going to be made maybe out of wool. If you're a little luckier, maybe out of silk, who knows? Probably just wool though. So this is, I think, one of my favorite images. This is an illustration of all of the things that we've just talked about all together. A woman standing in the kitchen of the Sandgate, which was sort of like a tavern in England. This is an illustration by Paul Sandby in the 1750s or 60s. And it sort of sums up how our role players dress. So you can see we've got all the little elements, the cap, the kerchief, the stays underneath, the shift, all the little details that we talked about. And then here are two of our role players. So I know that was a whirlwind with a lot of layers, but I think if you have any questions, we'd be happy to talk a little bit more about more that goes into it.
All right, so if anyone has a question, please feel free to type it into the chat. And I do have a couple of questions already. Maddie, you talked a little bit about the sources available, especially some interesting sources in Portsmouth. Could you talk a little bit more about where that original research comes from?
That's a great question. So we, many years ago when role-playing at Strawbery Banke first started, there were some pretty interesting developments, I guess, in the reenacting community. And so a lot of where our costume patterns have come from have been individuals who have studied historic garments up close and personal, and they've dissected them, they've gone into museums and been able to take a really close look at the type of stitches that were used, the materials that were used. And so what we have is all of their notes and then the notes of other costumers and other researchers from England, from other museums in the US. And we have lots and lots and lots of other references now that have been compiled over the 30 years that we've been role-playing.
You mentioned the bergère hat, and you said there was another name for it. Can you please remind us what that name was?
It's sometimes called a milkmaid's hat. And you sort of see that as, I guess, more like a joke. It's in a lot of cartoons of the period, which sort of make fun of people from the country. So that's sort of interesting.
Now, there's a lot more layers than we're accustomed to wearing. Do you have any idea of what this clothing would weigh, what you would be wearing in weight every day?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the season that you're wearing it. In the summer, you're going to wear a little bit lighter fabric. So linen is very light fabric and it sort of wicks away your body heat. It has very long fibers, and so it draws the heat of your body away from your body. And so it is a little bit lighter. I would say you're probably looking at like an extra 5 pounds of clothing, depending on how many petticoats you're wearing, the weight of your shoes and all of that sort of thing. That's a good question. That's a hard one.
And was there a certain age at which women started wearing all these layers? Was there a time where you weren't putting on all those petticoats and different accessories?
That's another great question. So I think it's a little hard to imagine today, but typically kids were sort of treated as miniature adults in terms of the way that their clothing was constructed. So there was a period where both boys and girls wore dresses until a boy, maybe was like 5. It sort of fluctuates with where they lived and what the tradition was. But you see that little girls, as soon as they've sort of grown out of the baby clothes, they're really wearing stays, and they're wearing petticoats, and they're wearing just really small versions of what their mothers are wearing. Often for really little kids, it was just sort of like a 1-piece or a 2-piece suit, or bodice and a skirt, so that you didn't have to dress and undress a toddler and all sorts of layers.
And we have a very strong role-playing program at Strawbery Banke Museum. Can you give us an idea of when this program began?
So we've always had reenactors and volunteers who have dressed up in costume, but our in-house role-playing program has been going on for almost 30 years. I think 27 years this year, which is pretty amazing. So we've developed and expanded the number of time periods that we do over time. But Pit Tavern was one of the first ones that we really costumed.
And can you talk a little bit about where we get the costumes for our role players?
So we have all sorts of ways to get our costumes. Early on, we didn't really have, it was sort of pre-internet, so we didn't really have a way of just looking up reproduction clothing. So it had to be handmade in-house by volunteers and by paid seamstresses. And we still do a lot of that today. We have folks so for us locally, and then if there's anything that, the cost sort of evens out, there are actually a lot of reproduction clothing makers now, all across the world, really, but especially in the Northeast, because there are so many reenactors and so many museums that require it. So we do order some things from them.
And historically speaking, not our own role players, but people in the past, how often would they launder their clothes?
I think it was often a personal or a family choice. Clearly not as often as we would, because it was a much more labor intensive process. It involved a lot of boiling water. And if you're only heating over your hearth, your fire in your kitchen, there's not a lot of space, and it would take a really long time to boil lots and lots of water. And so I think it sort of depends on the amount of work that you're doing. It's all very fluid, I think. If you're working really hard and you're working a really dirty job, you're probably going to launder your clothes a little more often than if you're, doing your average cooking and cleaning. But I mean, you'd probably do it. I would do it once a week, but maybe that was too much.
And I have a question here about undergarments. Can you give us an idea of when people started wearing more modern undergarments, things that we would recognize like underwear? And the comment was that they don't believe they were wearing anything under their shifts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that is true. So in some of those images that I showed, it's very difficult I think it would have been very difficult to wear anything else under your shift because you had so many layers on top of it. So your shift is like your base layer. And for women, that is just sort of like wearing a slip. It sort of prevents friction, I guess, a little bit, and chafing. And then for men, it would have been very much a long shirt, very similar to a shift. More modern undergarments are sort of a thing of the 19th century. I think you start to see in the early 20th century, things move a little faster with once elastic is invented and available. Things get a little different. But, really with a shift, you didn't have to size it up or down necessarily. If you are a young woman and you're expecting to marry and have children, maybe you would let out a side seam if you're pregnant or something, but you wouldn't really have to do a whole lot of alteration. You could wear the same thing for a long time, much longer than we would wear our clothing today.
And you mentioned that we had costumes made specifically for role players at Strawbery Bank, but that there are some online retailers that we occasionally visit. Can you tell folks where they can purchase their own set of historic clothing?
So there are some wonderful companies that are usually sort of family run by people in the hobby or people who have worked at museums or worked for museums in the past. So James Townsend, which I think is just called Townsend now, was a really early company, and they make clothes both for reenactors, but for people who just want to dress up in colonial costumes. They also do a lot of props and games and that sort of thing, which is neat. So you can do a lot of dress up and pretending if you want to do that at home, or if you want to start reenacting, they have some really nice things that you can take into a learning environment with you.
All right, thank you so much, Maddie. I think that's all the questions we have this afternoon. And I wanted to again thank everybody for joining us and remind you that we do have another talk coming up in January, on January 12th at 12 p.m. Objects of Mourning with Strawbery Bank's curator, Elizabeth Farish. And I hope if you keep your eyes open, you'll find the invite links, registration links, in our bank notes, our e-blast that go out. And again, thank you all for joining us. If anyone is interested, you are welcome at this point to leave or to unmute yourselves and chat a little bit if you'd like. Thanks so much.